Brian Nielsen, Administrator for Division of Aquatic Resources, also joined by David Sakota, our Fisheries Program Manager, and our aquatic biologist, Brian Ishida. Online, we have our aquatic biologist, Chris Teague, who's our district biologist for West Hawaii Fishery.
So the intent of this document was to provide the board with an overview of data and management for this fishery from the perspective of the division. So based on this management review, DAR classified this proposed fishery as low risk. So this was based on, again, data review do not suggest the proposed take will result in population level declines that would affect the long-term viability of the population. Data review do not suggest the proposed take will result in impacts to the ecosystem that would result in measurable declines in ecosystem health or the ability of the ecosystem to sustain itself. And lastly, current and proposed management measures would mitigate potential negative effects of the fishery and provide safeguards against unforeseen changes. So before we move forward, I want to talk a little bit about the reproductive biology of these species because it is relevant to this discussion. I also want to talk a little bit about juvenile fisheries. So all these species are broadcast spawners, meaning that they don't lay their eggs on a surface. They don't allocate any adult parental care to their juveniles. They basically fertilize their eggs in the water column. Those eggs then sail off on ocean currents, often to very distant areas. So basically what happens is adults produce eggs are turned into larvae, and these are planktonic. So this is the dispersal phase. After a certain period, these juveniles will then, or these young will then settle out onto the ocean floor as recruits. With some time, they'll become a little bit more hardy as juveniles and then become adults to close the circle. Now, it's important to recognize that this fishery is a juvenile fishery, meaning that it targets juveniles specifically. Now, this is important for the discussion because there's always some confusion about how a juvenile fishery can be less impactful to the population than an adult-based fishery, even though at times it can take more fish. So generally what we see is that as fish move through their life cycle from egg to adult, percent survival increases, often dramatically. So you can imagine being an egg floating in the ocean, your chances of survival are extremely low. There's a lot of things that want to eat you because you're so small. And the chance of just catching the wrong current and ending up in the pelagic ocean, in the blue, is really high. Now, conversely, for full-grown adults, your chance of survival is actually really high. Because of your size, there's fewer things that can eat you, and you have predator defense mechanisms, you can run away. So when we think about the TAC for yellow tangs, we think about, and which is 200,000 fish. You can imagine taking 200,000 fish just from the juveniles. So you have a pool of 200,000 fish, and you have to recognize that most of those fish will never reach the full size. They will never become fully fecund females and fully full-size males. So the impact to the bulk of the spawning population, which is these full-size fish, is not as direct as conversely taking 200,000 adults, which are a big portion of the spawning population, intuitively are going to be the hardest fish for the population to replace because of the high mortality at earlier life stages. So the 7 applicants from West Hawaii identified in the preferred alternative 8 coral reef finfish species that if allowed to continue in the fishery, they would be allowed to take. They include yellow tang, kole, orange spine unicorn fish, black sturgeon fish, Potter's angelfish, brown sturgeon fish, bird wrasse, and Thompson sturgeonfish. Okay, so number 4 is the TACs for 7 and 8 species will result in reductions in catch falling between 27 and 40% of their 2012 to 2017 mean landings. Now, this isn't significant just because it's a reduction in TAC. It also is important to consider that as we look back into trends and possible effects of this fishery, that if this fishery were to continue, it would be at a lower level. So we can maybe assume that the impacts will also be less, given that they're taking fewer fish.
TAC
Total level.
Okay.
Right here.
Okay. Lastly, and I was trying to keep it short, but I do have extra slides if you guys want to know how we came up with these estimates, but estimated harvest rates, even when based on conservative population estimates, were relatively lower year. This, again, provides a significant safeguard in regard to the fishery just exploding and expanding. Once again, the demand for these species can change very quickly. So this provides a meaningful cap on the total commercial harvest. So regarding question 1, our answer was no. DAR did not see clear evidence in West Hawaii Aquarium Project, which is WAP, or Pacific Island Fisheries Science Center Ecosystem Science Division, or PIFSC-ESD data to suggest that the proposed take will result in population level declines that would affect the long-term viability of the population. So first, workman populations of these species are generally robust in comparison to the rest of the main Hawaiian Islands, and in most cases, the Northwest Hawaiian Islands as well. So when we looked at PIFSC-ESD population estimates for West Hawaii and compared them to the rest of the Hawaiian archipelago, we found something that people may find counterintuitive, which is that the fishery that the populations of these 8 species where the fishery operates are actually some of the highest in the Hawaiian archipelago. Now, this doesn't mean that the fishery doesn't have an impact, but it does point to the fact that there may be other factors at play aside from commercial aquarium fishing that is determining the distribution of this fish. Second, the workman population of these species are generally stable over time, including when the fishery was active. So again, we looked at PIFSC-ESD population estimates, and we found no apparent signs of or no indicators that overfishing was occurring. So we didn't see when the fishery was active this progressively diminishing population over time. And for all 8 species, population trends were relatively stable. Okay, so moving on to the second question regarding ecosystem impacts. Our answer was no. DAR did not see clear evidence in WAP data to suggest that the proposed take will result in measurable declines in ecosystem health or the ability of the ecosystem to sustain itself. So when we looked, first, the data review did not reveal differences in percent coral cover across the 3 management area types. So if you look at the figure on the right, that is mean percent coral cover across the 3 management area types, again, FRA, LTP, and the open areas. Now, there's no error bars on these points, but if there were, they would overlap each other. Meaning statistically, we can't tell the difference between all 3 of them. What that says in general is that, there's not much difference, and we can't conclude that the commercial aquarium fishery is having a noticeable impact, at least as far as this data is showing. Second, there was considerable overlap in percent coral cover across the 3 management area types. So we took each of the sites and we broke them down individually, looking at both mean and the site-specific trends. And as you can see here, there's once again, like the fish trends, there's a lot of overlap between sites. And what we don't see is a major separation between how the open areas operates or acts over time versus the closed areas. There doesn't seem to be that much difference or discernible difference between the 3. Third, change in percent coral cover was relatively consistent across management area types. So we looked at absolute change in percent coral cover during 3 periods, in the pre-heat wave, and post-heat wave periods. Once again, very hard to tell differences between the 3 management area types. They all acted pretty similarly. And then at the site level, change in percent coral cover overlapped across management area types. So when we looked at a finer scale, looking at site-specific trends, once again, we could not tell the difference between the open areas and the closed areas. So once again, does this mean that the fishery will have no impact? The answer is no. The fact that we didn't see any difference between the open and closed areas could be due to a couple of different reasons. First, the survey itself just may not be equipped to pick up on certain types of impacts, and especially if they're relatively small, it just may not have the precision to do that. Second is that the West Hawaii area has a diverse assemblage of herbivores, and within that assemblage, there's quite a bit of redundancy. So it could be that focusing or a fishery that takes a certain component of that herbivore assemblage and takes only a portion of that population in total, in comparison to total herbivory, may not have a big impact. Question 3, regarding manageability. Yes, after review of existing and proposed management measures, DAR finds that they would likely mitigate potential negative effects of the fishery and provide safeguards against unforeseen changes. So we looked at 4 different types of management measures, including input controls, which is who can fish and how fishing occurs; output controls, which is what can be caught, including bag limits, size limits; and species restrictions, spatial controls where fishing can and can't legally occur, and monitoring, which is tracking the fishery and its impacts. The main takeaway was that based on current management measures and the management measures proposed by the applicants in the RFEIS, if this fishery were to continue, it would have some of the heaviest management in the region or in the area, and certainly in the inshore of Hawaii. So I want to focus on some specific management measures that really contribute to this conclusion. First is the Hawaii Environmental Policy Act, or HEPA requirement. This is the only fishery in the state that requires this HEPA review, and where there's this level of scrutiny on the entrance to the fishery, including approval of the amount of take that they'd like to harvest per year. Second is a revised whitelist. Limiting the fishery to 8 species increases our ability to manage, or our ability, because we don't have to follow, 100, 200 different species as they're being caught. We can focus on just 8 species. This also prevents the fishery from expanding out to include other species. In Appendix, I believe it's A of the document, you'll see a history of the West Hawaii Aquarium Fishery, and we do go over how quickly the demand for these species can change as consumer demand changes based on what they want to see in their aquarium.
Does show that there is some level of connectivity up and down the coast of West Hawaii. So there is likely some amount of genetic mixing there. So what we would expect in a system like this is that if you're removing fish from one section of reef, assuming it's what's called a sink location, a location where new recruits are coming into, then that will be replenished relatively quickly. And we sort of see this in the fishery, where those places that are targeted again and again. So they are being replenished with these juveniles to support the fisheries activities.
So third, target species juvenile density vary within and across management area types. So for this, we looked at the West Hawaii Aquarium Project, or WAP data. WAP data is unique because it separates the survey sites into 3 management area types. They are the FRAs, the fish replenishment areas, the LTPs, the long-term protected sites, and the open areas. So commercial aquarium fishing is allowed in the open areas and prohibited in the FRAs and LTPs. So WAP data is unique because it allows us to compare areas where fishing occurs and it doesn't occur. So when we compared the fish densities across these different sites, we saw actually quite a bit of overlap. So it wasn't necessarily always true that where the fishery is open that you see fewer fish. In fact, there's a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of variability actually within each management area type. So just because it's an open area, just because aquarium fishing is prohibited doesn't mean fish populations are always great. Sometimes you can have FRAs and LTPs that actually have poor habitat quality and poor fish density. We recognize that there will be an impact of this fishery. However, at the population level, at the wharf moat population level, it appears that it will likely not pose a significant threat to the population. Now, that still leaves the door open for certain areas seeing bigger declines than others, but the population appears to be relevant. So we assess risk of the fishery based on 3 factors. Population impacts, which would be the impact to the population of these species. Specifically, the population is defined as the wharf moat, the West Hawaii Regional Fishery Management Area. Second consideration are ecosystem impacts. Ecosystem impacts, not just because these species are important to the ecosystem in general, but there's also concern about future impacts of climate change, marine heat waves, coral bleaching. Some of these species are herbivores. Herbivores have been found to be integral in maintaining coral reef health, and in times of disturbance can contribute to resilience. Now, we didn't go in and try to quantify herbivory directly, but what we did do is we identified indicators of coral reef health and looked at those changes over time to try to get an idea of how this fishery may impact the ecosystem. The last part is manageability. Manageability is the ability of managers to control, monitor, and if needed, take action to manage this fishery.
So I think, yeah, looking at the response after that coral bleaching event, the adaptive management approach of continuing to monitor not only the populations, but the coral health, and then adapting, if we're seeing declines in any of those things.
Okay, so next is fishery dependent and independent monitoring. So for this fishery, we have multiple different types of fishery independent monitoring, including commercial logbooks, which are dealer logbooks, catch logbooks. Like we talked about, we have the Westway Aquarium Project, which is a fishery-specific survey. There's PIF's ESD, which is a population-wide survey, which includes the rest of the archipelago. And there's also some surveys that we didn't mention, including the shallow water resource fish survey and the fish and habitat utilization survey. Now, the surveys themselves are not safeguards, but coupled with emergency management capability and adaptive management, they do allow DAR to enact swift change in light of changing resource condition or unforeseen changes. Science is not perfect and stuff happens, and it's important to always have this in our back pocket, that if something happens, we can always make a quick change. Lastly, is spatial closures. So this is a really significant one. So within the WRFMA, about 47.7% of the WRFMA from 0 to 30 meters is off limits to commercial aquarium fishing. So this level of protection is not really seen too much in other fisheries. This level of protection is actually very high. It provides a lot of benefits, including protecting spawning population, larval production. It does, in some cases, also cut down on some user conflict, but not all. And then also, it's just important because it just protects nearly 50% of the population. That's a really important kind of safeguard baseline. We're not going to go and start
the sub areas that take up about 4 of these little boxes, and that was specifically for the aquarium fishery in the 1990s, the early 90s, and then following that in the late 90s was the fishery replenishment areas, which were the FRAs set as part of Act 306. And that was very much directed because of the aquarium fishery. Real quick, I looked up the endemism for these species, and the 2 that are endemic are the Kole and Potter's angelfish. The other ones are not.
So the latest protection, was the Miloli CDSFA, which restricts aquarium collection in 18 miles of coastline. So some of which I think was already protected, but it's extended.
Next is a size limits for the 2 species with the highest catches. So in the fishery, when it was active and under the preferred alternative, the bulk of the catch will be yellow tang and Kole. So in the WRFMA, there is a WRFMA specific regulation. There's a 5 fish possession limit for yellow tangs. It includes fish greater than 4.5 inches and fish less than 2 inches. Now, this kind of falls in line with the fishery preference. They prefer fish within the range of 5 to 10 centimeters. But this is still meaningful because in the open areas, it protects first newly settled recruits that can settle in large number, but are definitely not that hardy and may not survive captivity, and also protects full-grown adults, which are, of course, important for maintaining egg production. For Kole, there's also a WRFMA-specific possession limit for fish greater than 4 inches. Of course, right now that there's a statewide regulation kind of overlaying that of 5 inches and would require amendment to the HAR to. So based on this management review, DAR classified this proposed fishery as low risk. So this was based on, again, data review did not suggest the proposed take will result in population level declines that would affect the long-term viability of the population. Data review did not suggest the proposed take will result in impacts to the ecosystem that would result in measurable declines in ecosystem health or the ability of the ecosystem to sustain itself. And lastly, current and proposed management measures would mitigate potential negative effects of the fishery and provide safeguards against unforeseen changes.